Welcome to the Code and Bootstrapping podcast. Today we have Leandro Ostera, who has created or is in the process of creating a new programming language called OCaml, and it just hit 1.0 or 0.1 today. Leandro, welcome.
Hey, Mark. Thanks so much for having me here.
Yeah, this is interesting to me. It's kind of a bold thing to make a new programming language these days. It's at least in my experience, people are getting less and less interested in going away from the well-trodden path, and Elixir is already a ways out there. So, what prompted you to make another language on the Beam?
That's a good question. I agree with you that a lot of people these days they choose to stick to the guns, right? They speak Python, they speak JavaScript, they speak Elixir. They just keep to that and figure out how to make that tool, right, the language, work on their new problems as well. I think that at some point I've been writing Erlang for some time, and I've been writing OCaml for some time. And when switching back and forth, I recognize that the different skills that I'm required to work with code bases at scale is very different, right? On the one side, on Erlang, I need to be careful about supervision, trees, and make sure that the system will be reliable as it runs and stuff crashes, right? But I also need to write a lot of tests, and I need to be very, let's say, careful with how I am interacting with data from the inside and from the outside, and how I move the data and how I layer the system. And on the other side, on OCaml, right, since I mostly sit down and just play around with types until I have a description of my domain or my problem in the types that kind of makes sense, then after that, I can just start almost mindlessly coding, right? A refactor on the OCaml side, it's essentially following the compiler. The compiler says, oh, don't forget about this thing and that thing over there. Whereas in Erlang, if you didn't write the test, hopefully your supervision strategy will pick it up right when it crashes, because it will crash, right?
Localize the failure. So I think pretty much everyone on this channel is going to be at least somewhat familiar with Erlang because it's for Elixir programmers. But I actually haven't used OCaml before. I was really interested in it like 5 years ago. I was reading some blog posts about it. Jane Street had really interesting pieces about it. And the thing that kept me away actually was the concurrency story. I know OCaml is, it's an ML style language similar to F# or a much laxer Haskell. But what
we like to say it's pragmatic, not lax, but
yeah. Well, it's mutable, right?
Yeah, you do have mutability. You can do, you can program in OCaml like you program in C.
Yeah, and it's gotten a little more popular recently because of Reason React from Facebook.
Yep, that's correct, yeah.
So I'm curious, what context have you been using it in? Like, have you been using it to make interpreters, or have you been doing like lower level stuff, or has it been React?
So that's a good question. I would say I do work on the front end, and I do work on the back end as well, and in the layers in between. And I've used Reason and Reason React to write Reason React applications, right, like web applications. And I've used mostly Reason at the beginning, and then switched full time to OCaml to do developer tools on the backend side, right, like tooling. So one example is at a startup, I was working with an ontology, right, of the real estate domain. So we had like homes and owners and, contracts between them and so on. And we had all these defined in turtle files, which is a very funky language for defining ontologies or schemas of ontologies. And I wrote a tool called Turtle as well in OCaml that would read that, and it will generate Reason code for the front end to operate with this data, but also Erlang code, right? So the backend could understand how this data was shaped and validated and whatnot. I think that was the first piece of like production of OCaml code that was run as part of a CI pipeline and generated Reason and Erlang code that you would run.
That makes sense. So yeah, I can see how you get a lot of benefit from its type system for that kind of thing.
Yeah, as you said, like it's kind of an interpreter, right?
Yeah.
But the output of the program is more code.
Okay. So Yeah, so this is an interesting project to me for a few reasons. Like one is like on kind of on the meta level. Like I don't know what your strategy is or how seriously how serious of a project it is for you. But as I mentioned, like it's really hard to get mind share for a new language here, and you can kind of piggyback off of Elixir and Erlang and OCaml and React. So like
Yeah.
it gives you a little bit of a head start there, and it's also just as I'd mentioned the issues with GoCaml and concurrency. Like this seems like it would be a perfect fit to solve it, but I've also heard that it's really at least from what I've there was Zach Kessler who wrote one of the earlier book or not one of the earlier books, but he wrote a book I think about 10 years ago about Erlang. It's an O'Reilly book, and he made a video on the Beam channel on YouTube not too long ago that was talking about why there isn't a stronger type system in Elixir or in Erlang, and the difficulty of doing it because you can be receiving messages from other modules, and those modules can be upgraded in production, and
Yeah. Yeah.
like what's being sent to you like how do you handle that?
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Exactly.
at least from my very amateur understanding, it's a pretty thorny problem.
No, you're spot on. It is a thorny problem. I think that was the thing that got me started. I started looking into, why actually is it that Erlang is so hard to type? And I wrote this piece, why typing Erlang is hard, sort of sharing some of my findings on that. And it was through trying to find, a subset of the language that was well typed, that I thought maybe I could start with a language that I already know that is well typed, right?
Mm-hmm.
And see what part of that language fits into Erlang. And, that subset of that language that is also a subset of Erlang has to be well typed, right?
Right, right.
That was the hypothesis. And that's actually how Caramel was born, right? I sat down and said, okay, I have the entire OCaml language, and I'm going to start chopping things that can fit into Erlang. And I chopped the objective system because you can do OOP
I
as
saw
well
that.
in there.
Yeah.
And then I chopped the whole mutability story, right? And then what you end up with is this very, very small language, which is actually like Erlang in size, where you have modules, right? And you have recursive functions, and you have immutable values, and you know you have some pieces of data that you can pattern match on and do control flow through that. And that is type safe on the OCaml side. And as far as I've been able to see so far, right, it's also type safe on the Erlang side.
That makes sense.
But as you say, it comes with some trade-offs. Like you have to make some decisions here. Erlang is known for being this dynamic language, right, that lets you do things like dynamic dispatching. You don't know what the name of the function is or the module. You put a variable in there, and then you can just load a new module via config and just have the system just adapt to that.
Right.
You also have code reloading, right? Which, to be completely honest, I haven't had the actual need to use in production ever. Like, I know that it exists for a reason, right? And I imagine the reason is that they didn't have something like Docker to just say, well, here's a new container. But most of the time these days, people just ship a new container with the code. Nobody says, well, I have new Beam code. I'm going to, mount that into the container and actually reload this. When I say nobody, I mean superlative, right?
Yeah.
It's like there are people who do it.
I'm actually doing hot reloads on Alchemist Camp, but that's mostly because I don't want to pay for a load balancer or a second server. So it's a totally different reason than the telecoms are using like 30 years ago.
Yes,
But
still, I
yeah,
think that's
yeah,
a pretty good
it's
use,
pretty
right?
niche. I think of the people that I surveyed that were using Alchemist Camp, it was something like 1 in 4, 1 in 5 were doing hot code reloading.
Interesting.
And
I
they're also
don't
like
have data
learners.
to fight that claim.
I
Uh,
well, I suspect if it is a bigger company that already has a bunch of other languages and they're using Kubernetes for everything already, like their need to would be much less, just like you said.
yeah, yeah,
It's that makes sense because that's like one of the easier things to cut. One thing that you had written, or someone had written in some slides that you shared with me earlier, was an idea of still handling the mutable parts of OCaml, but doing it through NIFs. Is
Yeah.
that have you started messing around with that, or is that kind of like a far off future idea?
So I played around with that a little bit. Essentially, and here's where the techno babble will begin. Uh, you can compile OCaml code into C libraries. So you have a program or a library, and you turn it into a C library,
Yeah,
and you can generate, which I haven't, but I've manually written some NIF code, right, which is C code that can be linked with this C code that has the OCaml code, right.
yeah,
So then after that, when you write the Erlang or Elixir binding to the NIF, you can call the C code that will call the OCaml code. But you need to do a little bit of juggling between the data types, because what you consider a list in Erlang, right, that gets turned into like the C representation of a list in the NIF will not be the same representation that OCaml expects for a list. So you have to go back and forth from there. I think that's an area that could open up the entire ecosystem of OCaml to Erlangers and Elixirs or alchemists, right? Um, but I have deliberately descoped that part of the work from what Caramel will be focusing on going forward. There may be room for that to come if we stabilize what the focus is right now, right? But
yeah. That totally makes sense. I mean, it seems like a massive undertaking. So speaking of stabilized right now, or like how many people do you think are using Caramel already, and how many people have contributed so far? Like where is it in the
I
language
hope
development
nobody is like
stage?
using it right now, because even though I think it's in a spot where you can play with it, right? I don't think it's in a spot where I would be comfortable running like writing software in it. Of course, you can always inspect the Erlang outputs and be like, yeah, this kind of makes sense. But the more complex things get, like if you have complex state machines, right? The output gets a little thorny, gets a little wonky to read, and you might as well rewrite that in Erlang if you wanted to run the Erlang to begin with. But we're just a V01. We're gonna
Yeah,
get
yeah.
there slowly.
Well,
Um,
it's kind of amazing to me. I'm guessing you've heard of Phoenix Live View, right?
yeah,
It's still not 1.0 now, but I know people who were running it in production a year ago, or just about a year ago. So
right. Cutting
it's
edge.
surprising. Yeah, there's a surprising number of people that just jump in without worrying about. In fact, I'm pretty sure a lot of people did that with Elixir before 1.0 as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Maybe not at 0.1, but yeah. So how long have you been at this, and how? I guess what are your expectations? Like what kind of timeline do you hope for, and what do you see as likely?
So I wanna use Caramel, right? I
Hmm.
wanna be able to build really large Erlang systems or Elixir systems and to refactor them fearlessly. To say, well, the domain changed, we learned something new, we need to change this core type. And I know that after maybe 3-4 hours of refactoring a huge system, right, it will be fine. I will be okay. I don't have to actually deploy thinking that I don't really know if this works or doesn't work. No, I will have a guarantee that this kind of errors, which is very, very common when you're working with structure maps,
Hmm.
changing fields, and changing atom names and whatnot, those will be going away. They will be gone. They will not exist in the process. So I want that, and I would like to start writing stuff in it, in the next couple of months. I know that I'm going to be one of the early adopters because I'm
I would hope
building it,
so. Yeah.
right? Yes. So I actually have right now one project that I am starting to build in Caramel, but I'm only building the core right now, like the actual domain logic in it,
Hmm.
and I'm using Elixir and Phoenix and all of the proven tools to build the rest around it. The hopes would be that maybe by the middle of the year, maybe we'll have like a zero point 0.2 or 3 or whatever number
Yeah.
comes. that I could say, okay, you have a nice DSL for consuming Phoenix, right? It's a type DSL. Maybe it's part of the standard library, maybe it's not. We'll see. And you can write your web server in that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe you can even do it in Reason, right? And then you write your Reason frontend as well, Reason React frontend.
That would be interesting. Yeah, yeah. Like someone could just write the whole thing in Reason or OCaml, and that's interesting. So one thing that's great, I guess, it's really dangerous because this is a tiny fledgling project. But one thing that's great is since it's so early, anyone who's working on it now can work on like the interesting stuff that gets used a lot in the future if it grows.
Yeah, exactly.
What parts of it do you need help with right now? Like for someone watching right now who's like, I want to work on a new language. Like,
yeah. All right. So there's a couple of things that come to mind, right?
mm-hmm.
I think that the focus of OCaml going forward will be to solidify as an actual language, right? Which means, we're packing a formatter on the VO1. I want to figure out how to pack a language server. There is Merlin. How can we pack Merlin into the same binary? So you download the binary, you have the tools you need to work with OCaml. You have the formatter, you have language server, you have the compiler in there, right? Some of these things, if you can think of it, if you out there listening to this can think of anything, right, that your current favorite programming language does, right, in terms of tooling, then I want to hear what you're thinking. Just drop by the issues or discussions and let me know, or join our Discord.
Yeah, I'll put the link for that in the show notes.
Thanks. So that's one area. The second area would be the actual library bindings. And this will be akin to saying, there's an Erlang library, but it doesn't have a nice Elixir interface. And we write this tiny library that's a module that sort of gives you these DSLs for talking to the Erlang library. It will be pretty much the same thing. We write them in OCaml, right? Or hopefully shortly in Reason as well. And you essentially write a lot of external calls that hopefully go away during compilation. So it costs 0 to actually call that Elixir code, right? But it's type safe. So these tiny libraries that you will be writing, we call them bindings, right? Essentially interface between the typed OCaml world and the untyped Beam world, right? And let you sort of consume Beam libraries safely. That's a huge space. And this is both standard library stuff, right? And other things like, can we get a type Phoenix, for example, type plug, and so on and so forth. So that's another space where if you have any thoughts about what library you'd like to use, just swing by and I'll be happy to help you get started and, help you figure out how to write bindings as well that are idiomatic for the OCaml side.
What's
and
this?
the third area? Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. The third area is the actual compiler, right? And so like all of a sudden, even though I've narrowed the scope down of OCaml, right, this is still like a massive thing. You have all the tooling, you have the libraries that you need, and then you have the compiler itself. And when it comes to the compiler, if you're into software verification of any kind, just let me know so that we can guarantee, right, that we respect the OCaml type system, not just at the type checking level, but also after code generation, right? So that we don't generate code that actually has bugs because, it can, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's the whole reason anyone would want a type system is to have security and confidence that they don't have that. So makes sense. What's the state of Erlang interop right now? So I with some of your help, got the basic Hello World set up, and I'm wondering, can you drop Erlang functions into the caramel code, kind of like in Elixir? You can just give the atom name and then dot and call the function that way.
It's a little more expensive for the programmer than that, because the compiler needs to know what types to expect of this function, right?
Makes sense.
So I think I wrote a piece in the OCaml manual about calling Erlang code, right? And in that, I could send you a link as well later, or right now.
I've got it open actually.
Oh, perfect. Yes.
Yeah, I just must have missed this.
Yeah.
Calling
so
Erlang
in that
code. Yeah.
Yeah, in that piece, you'll see that I'm opening it myself here so I can follow through as well. Calling Erlang code. Yeah, I sort of explain how is it that OCaml and Caramel, right, lets you call code from different languages, right? And in this case, Erlang would be the foreign language we're trying to communicate with, but this could also be Elixir. And for OCaml, this will normally be C code. Like you have some OCaml code
Makes
and you need
sense.
like a really fast math library. You go to, a math library in C and then you write this binding. And the idea is that with almost a single line, you can say, hey, compiler, hey, Caramel, there's this external function, right, that has this name, right? And it should have these types. These are the inputs, these are the outputs, right? And you can even say, to us inside of Caramel, it has one name, but to the other people, right, the foreign code, it has this other name.
Okay. So
And yeah,
so this is just how it works in OCaml normally. Then you're just
yes,
following the same convention and making it work with Erlang as well as C.
yes.
Okay.
Fun fact: when you're writing Reason for the web, and these days when you write Rescript, right, this is also the exact same way that you bind to JavaScript code.
What's Rescript?
Oh, so Reason and the buckled script compiler that
Yeah, Buckle
grabs
script is
Reason.
the OCaml to JavaScript one.
Exactly, yeah. Buckled script sort of rebranded to Rescript some time ago.
Oh, okay. So it's
Random
okay.
stuff, yes.
So it's like OCaml.js.
Exactly, OCaml JS. Not to be confused with JS of OCaml, which is yet another compiler to JavaScript for OCaml. But yeah, so trying to answer your question, right? Sometimes this bindings, this interop is going to be pretty cheap because you already know the name of the function. So you will create your module file, put the external call there, and then you can just use it as if it was a function that you created yourself. Sometimes it's going to be a little trickier because the inputs or the outputs of the function are too dynamic for Caramel. And that is both a good and a bad thing, right? Because if it's too dynamic, then someone will have to pay the cost of figuring out what actually is going on in there. But when you make it less dynamic, then the compiler can guarantee you, okay, this is the exact call you're trying to make. One example of this is on the ETS, right? ETS has this one insert function that you take a table and then you either take one element or like a list of elements, right?
Yeah.
Caramel can't represent that at the external level very nicely. So you have to actually create two externals, one for insert one and one for insert many, right? Where they have different signatures. One of them is insert one takes one element of the table, insert many takes a list of elements of the table. They all both compile to the same Erlang ETS insert call, right? So it's not more expensive to have these 2, 3, 4 FFIs like bindings, but they give you more granularity at the type level to guarantee that you actually are doing what you think you're doing.
And one other thing I'm wondering about is, so in Elixir and Erlang, the arity of a function is part of its name, and it's a really important distinction. Does OCaml have that?
Not quite, right? Because in OCaml itself, all the functions have one argument.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So that when you have a function, let's say add of x and y, right? And you write it down like let add space x space y equals, you're actually saying there's a function called add that when you give it one argument called x, it will return a function, right? That takes one argument called y. And when you call that one, that's the job.
Automatically curries it.
Exactly. So everything is curried by default, and you can partially apply things by default, which can be good or bad, right? Depending on which side of the camp you are. There's not a lot of point-free programming happening in OCaml, like you would normally see in Haskell, for example. And I'm kind of happy about that, because I think point-free programming is sometimes fast for typing, but hard for reading. So OCaml makes the pragmatic choice of you can do partial application, but a lot of people just say, well, I'm actually going to not partially apply this, put a lambda around it, and so on.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's I'm not super familiar with that world, but I know there were a lot of choices like that where Haskell, say, like made everything lazy by default, and Scala and F Sharp and other languages didn't do that.
Yeah.
So
In this case, Caramel, just like Caramel actually has the let's say evaluation semantics of Erlang, so it will actually run like Erlang code.
that makes
So
sense.
yeah, so it
Yeah.
does. It doesn't really generate, like it won't default to generating RET1 functions for everything in the Erlang code, right?
All right, got it. Okay, so this has been a bit of a technical deep dive.
Yeah,
actually
we can
it's
pull it back up.
yeah, it's a, also, I mean, just for me, because I have never written anything significant in OCaml. In fact, I've just written a hello world, and that's it. So it's I've read about a lot of these technologies, but we're combining multiple things that are fairly niche. So it's a bit tough to follow. But one thing that I would be interested in hearing, that should be pretty easy for everyone, is what's your strategy for growing a language? Because if nobody uses it, I guess you could have a nice tool for yourself, but you obviously have put a lot of time into this, or aiming for a tool that lots of people use.
I think that's a really good question. Just that the phrasing "growing a language" reminds me of that Guy Steele talk of the same name.
Oh,
It's a nice talk. I think that I'm trying right now to build something that people would be happy to write the hardest parts of their systems in, right? So that they can really use the type system. This is not to say that they don't need to write tests for it, right? Writing software is hard, and if we can use more tools to figure out what's wrong and how to make software a little better, then we should. So when it comes to growing the number of people that will be using Caramel, I think I'm going to try to make it as easy to dropping some Caramel code on existing Erlang, existing Elixir applications, to sort of encapsulate the core, that kernel that needs to be correct, and then you can still write all of the sort of stuff around it, right? In Elixir or Erlang, and reuse the fantastic DSLs that we have in Elixir for building web applications and stuff. And part of making this easy is not just having a plugin that figures out exactly what tools you need and downloads everything for you, right? But also
VS Code tried to do that when I was setting it up.
Yeah.
But
That's
of course,
good.
it was grabbing like OCaml and Reason stuff.
Yeah, I think I might need to come out with a new extension.
Yeah. It just saw that .ml, and it was just like, oh, I've got a bunch of extensions for you.
Yeah, you need to download all these things. Yeah, but another part of making this easy for people onboarding, right, is to have a good manual. To have a good place for saying, this is how I get started, right? This is all of the different guides and material that you need when you're in like that cycle, right? To be fully honest,
That's a great place to contribute too.
Yes,
Like anyone
please.
who tries to do something with it and gets confused. In fact, I'm willing to add a bit to the setup docs myself.
Exactly, 100%. I've even I've been learning how to write better. English is not my first language, right? So all of the things I'm saying to you are partly what I picked up learning English from Metallica when I was a teenager, and from here and there, right?
Nice.
And these days I've been reading a lot about for example, this book, Strategic Writing for User Experience. It has a very, very nice chart that is what I'm using to mold the manual sections, where it says, people, they start and they have a problem, right? And they're trying to investigate what the problem is and verify whether your solution is good before they commit to actually getting, starting to use it. And once they do that, they try to set up and start using it. So if you look at the manual, I'm like, okay, first it's going to be an introduction. You're clearly looking for what this is. You have some questions. You want to verify that your assumptions are correct. Is this type safe? Is this going to be maintainable in the long run, and so on? Once you verify that, you want to commit. And how do you commit? By sort of checking, is it free? Do I have to pay for it or not? And then after you've decided to give it a shot, like you just did, right? You need to figure out how to set it up. So there will be some installation and first steps to get you onboarded and so on. So I'm really trying to figure out, how is it that programming languages normally fail at getting people onboarded and using them fast, right? So not to make the same steps and same mistakes. So as you say, if you want to contribute to the manual, please just get in touch. I think this is a huge thing that needs to be just brilliant, right? For OCaml to actually pick up pace.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Like, if I stumble over a problem myself, I'm more than happy to contribute to something to help the next person from not doing that. That's kind of what this whole YouTube channel is about, to be honest.
Right.
So the other thing that might, I mean, if we're just throwing out ideas, one thing that I think might help a lot would be getting into ASDF. Because most Elixir programmers, at least as far as I know, most Elixir programmers are using ASDF to install Elixir and Erlang. And a lot of them are also using it to install JavaScript and Ruby and just like all their languages.
Right. Yes, I think that would make sense. I think you're touching on an important topic here. I don't think that OCaml will end up including tools to build projects on its own, right? But will rather remain a compiler of individual files with tooling to work through those files. So you would essentially be working with OCaml through your Elixir project or through your Erlang River project. It will be interesting to see if you provide support at the ASDF level, when you install it, what will people do with the OCaml binary? Like, you have to go OCaml compile and then say, these are all of the files that I will ever want to compile, or call them in the right order. And for that, we have a short depths and so on. It's like a lower level tool.
So would you want so for people coming from Elixir, would you want the workflow to be like mix OCaml compile, or just mix OCaml maybe?
Ideally, it would just be mix compile.
Just mix. Okay, yeah. That would just be mix.
Yes, exactly.
So it would you'd pick some directory, probably lib or maybe like lib/OCaml or something, and then just whenever you compile your mix project, it all gets bundled in. That makes sense.
Yeah. It's like you don't have to really think about the tooling. It's drop the plugin there, start writing your OCaml code, and the plugin will download the right binaries, the standard library, and so on. I guess all the libraries could be distributed as an XPM package as well, so you just get them as you know.
At least as of this recording, though, we need to include it in the mix project, and then also download a binary, and then make sure the binary is in a path. And
that's correct. Yes, and even then, you will have a small issue, and is that prior to the VO1, right, VO014, the OCaml binary was called OCaml-C.
Oh.
Yes, because I thought it was going to be even a smaller surface area, just the compiler, right? Just like you have a Erl-C or Elixir-C or OCaml-C as well. So the dropping that C essentially means the plugins are right now broken. I'm working on that. Just give me some time. It'll get done.
I can give you a few days before I publish a video. No problem.
All right. Yes, I can do that.
All right.
So in 3 days from now, then it'll be fixed.
All right. Well, this sounds like an exciting project. And do you have anything else you want to share with everyone?
Well, I mean,
maybe a Twitter, the Discord. I'll put in the link. So you got a Discord.
Wasn't prepared for that question. Yes, we have a Discord link, right? That I'll make available for you folks. There's a repo, right, on GitHub. There's the Twitter account of the language, right? I'm honestly just enjoying myself right now with that account and posting dope memes, dank memes around typing and Star Wars. But it will be the place where all of the automated releases will go to and so on, as I sort of automate the pipelining. I mean, I'm doing all this work in the scope of a company I started for doing this work called Abstract Machines, and that's kind of the tools I want to build there. It will be a while, but you got to start somewhere.
Have you got any like speaking events or anything lined up in the future, or still kind of?
Actually, yeah, there is one in the talks, the functional programming meetup here in Sweden, which I reckon is going to be online now. So everyone's invited. I will make sure to give you a link to that as well.
All right, all right. I will put that in the show notes as well.
Cool.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time.
Oh, thank you so much for the opportunity to share this. Yeah, this has been great. Thanks.
Yeah, we'll have to keep an eye on it.